Welcome, Marisa, to the show. I'm honored to have you on. The audience may or may not have read your bio. So if you want to kind of walk through where you come from, what you're doing now, why don't you do that intro? Because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I'm thrilled to be here with you. I'll try to make the bio relatively short. I began as an engineer and worked in manufacturing for a number of years. Did my MBA, joined at the time Anderson Consulting, which became Accenture, and worked there all my way up to kind of the partner level. At the end, I was the aerospace lead for the practice, which was super fun. And then a VP of operations role at a large telecom company. And after that, it was a really tough transition for me. I'd gone from like a culture I really knew to a culture that I didn't really know, and I wasn't really happy. And then I decided to do this crazy thing called work for myself. So 9 years ago, I decided to pivot. It was kind of on a dare from my husband, so I can't really take credit for it. He kind of dared me, and I don't know how that worked, but I took the dare. And I became really fascinated throughout my journey, kind of shifting from what I would say was the early part of my career where I was all about technical mastery, really liked figuring out things, how things kind of worked and building things, to kind of business mastery. And then you realize as you kind of get older that it's all about leadership. And so now I'm obsessed about leadership. My company is called Leaderley because I believe your journey to your best leader is your journey to your best life, your outcomes, et cetera. I mean, it's all about this thing called leadership. And so for the last 9 years, I've been focused on learning and writing and researching and working with a beautiful portfolio of clients. I do primarily executive coaching and executive team, high performance teaming work with executive teams. So I get this incredible opportunity to work alongside some phenomenal leaders that I learn from and help on their journey to their best leader.
So I'm curious, you have this big corporate background and your husband kind of gave you a dare. Is he an
Yeah.
entrepreneur?
No, he's not, but I was unhappy. I was unhappy and he was sick of me whining. And yeah, we were, and what he called me on was that I was sort of, it's kind of this thing with my corporate career where I would have, roles for 18 months to 30 months roughly, right? So I'd get a new
Yeah.
job, I'd dig in, I'd like figure it out, and then I'd master it, and then they'd move me somewhere else. And then I'd have to do that again and again and again. And for a while there, that was fun. But I guess the last two times it happened, which was, like a 4 year period, I wasn't happy. And he dared me because I said, "Oh, it's okay. I'll get the team together and I'll be okay in 18 months." And he was like, "In 18 months, you're going to have another one of these jobs. Like, if you don't like what you're doing, you should quit." And then when he said you should quit, he was like, "I dare you to quit." And so anyway, it's not a best practice. It really is not a best practice to quit on a dare. But it began this incredible journey of self-discovery because it felt really good for 5 minutes until I was like on the floor in my bedroom figuring out like what the heck just happened. And a lot of self-reflection, but it's been an incredible journey of learning. And I've written 3 books now on leadership, and I never thought I would write anything. But I wrote my 3 books because I was learning so much. Every 3 years, I'm like, I've
Yeah.
learned all these things. I need to write these things down. So anyway, it's been an incredible journey. I don't regret it at all, but I cannot take credit for that. People are always
That's
like, "That was
funny.
so courageous." I was like, "I don't think it was courageous. I think it was one of those silly
I think it's
things."
I think it's funny when you mention your husband complaining about your whining. I remember Steve Martin in Cheaper by the Dozen. What are we, the whiner family? It's like, I would love that. Um, so I think that's great. It's interesting too that we have a similar journey of studying leadership in that in 2002 I had a .com go .bomb, and then I went through a kind of an epiphany change thing, and I realized I had leadership attributes but no skills.
Mm,
And my main breakdown was I wasn't systematic. And so I came from a place of teaching people how to avoid my mistakes. Sounds like you came from more of a place of you really had a lot of leadership down,
mhm,
but you needed to go deeper maybe, and
mhm,
you needed to really work on. So my congrats to you on following that journey. And
mhm.
and it sounds like you're in the same boat I'm in, still learning, still growing. So here we go. And hopefully, as a matter of fact, not hopefully, I'm confident you get some great tips for our audience today.
Mhm.
And before we dive into some specific questions, I'll throw you a little curveball, in maybe not a curveball, but if we didn't have this whole time to talk, and you're like, oh, I only have one thing I can give this audience, what advice would you give them?
Ooh, that's good because right now I'm obsessed with this idea of your blind spot is your breakthrough. Um,
Oh yeah, I love that. I love that in your book. I saw that in the book, The Blind Spot. Yeah,
yeah,
man,
your
I love
blind spot
that.
is your breakthrough. Um, you just talked about it and I just talked about it, right? What are those blind spots that are going to unlock the next version of you? And so for me, it was being, in fact, my struggle in kind of contrasting to yours, I was extremely systematic. I was an engineer. I learned in project management. I was systematic. So I had systems down, but
Yeah.
systems at some point don't scale and they don't provide the vision, the inspiration, the market. Like you probably, you starting your business, you had vision on spades. You had all these attributes that enabled you to kind of birth something. I had systematic and I was missing sort of that next thing, which this entrepreneurial journey kind of forced me to do. Like, what value creation am I going to do in the world, as opposed to how am I going to just sort of manage all of these things that other people have figured out and that I just need to execute on. So we kind of had opposite journeys in some ways. But those are all, if I could give the audience one thing, it's get super, super curious about your blind spots. And the only way to do that is to get feedback because we cannot see it. I'm teaching my 16-year-old to drive right now. He never checks his blind spots. It's terrifying. I have a brand new car. I mean, it's even easy now. There's a big flashing light on the mirror when there's a car in your blind spot, and he still doesn't check his blind spots.
Yeah.
And as leaders, we're often sort of changing lanes or trying to navigate. We have all these witnesses around us. It's hard to get good feedback as a leader, and you have to double down on that openness. But that's where you will find your blind spot, and that is your key. Like, you need to dive into it with curiosity because that's where you'll unlock your next level of greatness.
Very interesting. So I want to go back. This is not a marriage podcast, but I want to go back to your husband for a moment. So usually opposites attract. So you're extremely systematic, detail oriented. You didn't say this, but want to do it once and do it right and not go back to it again.
Mhm.
And you would rather be right than be on time. And so, okay. So you're like, wow, how did you know me? So is your husband the opposite? Is he more visionary, idea oriented, even though he's still corporate?
He's way more relational.
Okay,
So I would be more
relational, yeah.
transactional. I've had to learn to be much more relational.
Yeah.
He was much more, I'm much more transactional. He's much more creative. He doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes. Like, he thinks he makes sense, but he doesn't. And eventually he makes sense, but not in the moment. And he's Swiss, so he is always on time.
Oh, there we go.
Which was
or early.
Yes, which was a huge shock for us early in our marriage because I was never on time.
So the reason I bring this up for the audience, I want to remind you that building on what you're saying, Marisa, is that you're talking about feedback, and we have to get feedback from people that we may not be comfortable with. And their initial comments, either their tone of voice or the words they use, we may not like, we may not agree with, but if we're willing to receive it and then think about it, I think I saw this in your book too. I'm not, this isn't just me. I think I saw this as I was perusing the book, that may lead us to have an epiphany, have a light bulb go on in an area that was a blind spot, but we needed them to kind of hit us on the head with a 2x4, a verbal one. I still love that phrase, although I did talk with a young man whose dad hit him with a 2x4.
Oh,
and it really slows me down every time, but I still like it verbally as a metaphor. That if we can receive that and kind of process it, that, okay, because a lot of times that wrong judgment they're making on us is based on a partial truth.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So talk about that a little bit, because I think this is huge for people.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm in the business of trying to sometimes be an intermediary. So with almost all my coaching programs, I do what I call stakeholder interviews, where I basically interview people who are critical to their success. And I go in and I kind of investigate and I ask about, what are the things they could do more differently? What are the things that would improve the collaboration? I ask things like, what's something they do that really doesn't bring the best out of you? I ask all these questions. I'm like the little investigator, and I come back with really, really, really detailed feedback to help people just really get a sense. And I do multiple people, and there's themes. There's themes everywhere. There's themes with people that you have really great relationships with, in fact, what's surprising when I first started doing this work was that the themes are very similar, whether you have an amazing relationship or a terrible relationship. The difference is the intensity of the irritation on the other person. The people that love you, they still see these things. It's not that you're not doing them with these people. You're still doing them. They're just sort of like, it's endearing to them. It just doesn't bug them that much. It's still probably suboptimal, but it doesn't bug them that much. Whereas that same action with people where there's a challenged relationship will have an incredible intensity. And so there'll be varying intensities, but it's kind of undeniable that there's these things that they're doing that are not optimizing their team. And as a leader, your individual performance is no longer really relevant. You're a rounding error, right? You are responsible for the collective performance of hundreds of people, potentially, right? And so it's like you could sit there and you'd be like, this is my style. You can get kind of stubborn about it. Like, this is just who I am. And it's like, yeah, well, it's upsetting 99 other people. So you can stay there if you'd like, but if you'd like to grow or scale or have more ease or influence or alignment, you may want to experiment with these things. But when I bring this feedback to my clients, there's like the shift between how dare you, like there's, how dare you, it's like this really, and we move through that together to thank you so much. It goes from like, how dare you to thank you, right?
Yeah.
And it's normal. The how dare you is normal. And the reason why it's normal is because what we're hearing is out of line with what our intention was, right? I talk a lot about intention. Our intention is they're not referring to your intention. They know you have positive intention. They're referring to the impact you're having on them. So when you hear the feedback, you're like, how dare them? I worked so hard for them. I set up I did this, and you're all in your intention, but your intention's invisible to them. So they're blind to your intention, you're blind to your impact. And unless we have these dialogues, we miss out on some breakthroughs for each other.
But do you ever have people that are upset also because they got caught?
Ooh, that's interesting. I don't know that they admit it.
Yeah.
I try very hard. Like I'm like a scientist by training. And so one of the things I try to do.
You and Jim Collins.
One of the things I like to do is just look at these feedback. All the feedback has data. And I want to look at it on a scatter plot. I want to be like, this person says this person, and I want to figure out where that trend line is. And I try to encourage my clients to not emotionally, like, people often sort feedback by emotional intensity. And so we're adding some kind of other axes around how much does that annoy me, as opposed to, is it frequent and is it consistent and might there be something to explore here? So I'm rarely trying to help people understand why it happened or whether it's right or not or all those kinds of things. I'm just trying to be like, here's the scatter plot, here's the trend line, here are some experimentations we probably want to run to see if we can shift it. And I'm trying to get the client to a quick win very, very quickly, because as soon as they start to realize that these very small calibrations, I mean, what's funny about like these situations is it sounds really big, and then there's these very small things that a leader can do that will transform the impact. And so I remember, I guess I'll go back to when I first had a coach. I remember thinking that I needed a lobotomy to address all the feedback I was hearing. Like, I was like, they don't like anything about me. Like, it's an emotional experience. And then I remember working with my coach, realizing it's actually these really small tweaks that can make a big difference.
Yeah. So give me, by the way, I loved your thing of saying you're a rounding error. It reminds me of, I love the series, A Person of Interest on Amazon. And there's a bad coder. You're shaking your head. Maybe you watched it. I love the series where she says, people are just bad code. So that's what reminded me, that comment
Yeah.
about her comment about bad code. But you talk about these little things. If I was in the audience right now, I'd be wondering, so give me some stories, some examples, whatever, of what are those little things? Is
Yeah.
it as simple as tone of voice, or is it simple? I mean, I could go through another list, but I want to hear from you of what are some examples that might make that light bulb go on for people. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, maybe I do that.
Yeah. So often it is, so I'll give you just a personal example. So in that example with my 360-degree feedback, I found out that people hated my meetings, which seems like a bad thing. Given that as a leader, your communication, like, your people are supposed to, meetings are fairly important.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was like, why? Like, that was shocking. Like, why? So my intention with those meetings, the way I would run those meetings at this point, I have a big workforce, a lot of projects. So I'm obsessed about efficiency. So my intention going into that is like, let's get in there. Let's be really specific about what needs to get done. Let's check in. Let's make sure nobody has any problems, and let's get them out of there as soon as possible. Right. So it would be kind of this, I was just in this mode, this energy. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I found out that people didn't sleep Sunday night because of my Monday morning meeting, hated these meetings, felt that they were called out all the time, like all kinds of bad. And it was terrifying. And I paralyzing, in fact. And I was like, I don't even understand how much I have to change. Like, do we have to do like a whole offsite at a spa together? Like, I don't know what we have to do to just reset this environment. And what my coach encouraged me to do is think of the smallest thing you can do to just change the dynamic of that meeting. And I came up with two things. The first was just totally change my energy. Like, I had to get rid of that crazy driver, like time scarcity kind of energy. Like, I came in that I had to rush, so that I had to change my energy. I was like, let's pretend that this is like a celebration meeting. Like, we just finished a project and we're getting it together to celebrate. So I had to kind of trick my mind that we were going to go in and just see energetically, what did it bring if I just assumed everything was good instead of assumed everything was bad, right? Which was what I was doing. So that was one shift. And the other thing is, I just did this very quick, like, who wants to add to the agenda? Like, what do you guys want to talk about today? Like, blah, 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 blah. And over a series, it wasn't immediate, over a series of meetings, it really shifted beautifully from me doing 80% of the talking like a dictator to me facilitating, the agenda and having them doing 80% of it. And it was amazing. It was amazing. Ownership came up, accountability came up, cross synergies came up, like all kinds of magic started to happen that had very little to do with me. Now, what I realized in hindsight is that meeting went from being for me to being for the 9 people that the meeting should have been for all the time. So that's a little small shift. Now, it feels big and it might sound big, but it's very small, in terms of behaviors. I mean, we're all smart people. We can figure out how to do something a little bit differently.
Fabulous. Marisa, I want to shift gears a little bit. So you talk about in your book, Blind Spots, about identifying your cultural biases. Mm-hmm. Now, today, certain people have hypersensitivity about any type of bias, but we're wired for bias as a survival mechanism. So talk to me, or talk to the audience a little bit about what you're advising here with being aware of your cultural bias, and then maybe dive in a little bit about where's that good and where's that bad, and what do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just maybe start with a story. So right now we're living, many of my clients are going through hypersensitivity, as you described, and an explosion, frankly, of what I would cultural preferences or ways in which we want to address each other or be treated, or how we feel safe or not safe. And I mean, there's just this explosion, and it's pretty beautiful. It's kind of like it's the explosion of all kinds of different new thinking. And it requires from leaders, though, for an incredible amount of openness. And I think that sometimes as all of us sort of find our best practices or our ways of being, we get kind of addicted to our version of what efficiency looks like and of what effectiveness looks like and all these kinds of things. And we live in a world now where there's no single problem we can solve without a lot of diversity of skill set. So we're going to bump in to a whole bunch of diversity as we need to attack diverse skills. And part of the things that I think is important is for us to self-recognize that most of our cultural biases, they're just because of the way we walked through life. And everybody walks through life a little bit differently. And so holding our cultural biases very lightly is really important. And avoiding the need to challenge, understand all the time, dig to the bottom of, debate with other people's cultural bias. So I'll give you an example of one of the.
Now you're talking work culture, right?
Yes, but I'm also talking. I mean, I think our all of our belief systems come into work as humans, right?
Oh no, I agree. I'm just trying to make sure I'm tracking with you. So
Yeah. But let me just give you an example of Allison the advocate. So I worked with a client, and Allison's phenomenal leader in many, many ways, very effective, on the fast track, very senior. And people love her because she advocates for people. She's an amazing sponsor. And in her stakeholder interviews, people talked about how she took people down in front of other people on a regular basis. So they love, except there's these scary moments where in public she would take people down. And oftentimes she would take people down for some kind of cultural preference. Like maybe it was, you said he too often when you referred to a leader instead of being gender neutral, or maybe it was you didn't think about having including this group, or maybe it was, all these things that, were positive, had a positive intention, except the way that she would do it was she would kind of attack people, and she would often attack, or people would feel attacked. And she would often attack people in public. And so it created a lot of tension and a lot of discomfort where she was trying to create inclusion. She was creating exclusion because people were very, very scared about saying anything in front of her. So that's an example where I had to work with her to sort of say, you have all these beautiful aspirations around how you evolve the culture, but you have to be cautious, right? About you're not going to influence everybody if everybody's kind of afraid, and no one even wants to include you in some things because it's so scary, right? And with her, it was this constant taming of her advocate monster. So an advocate was both her strength and her weakness. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, I mean, it makes sense. And so, I mean, you know the old phrase, you praise in public, you reprimand in private. And so it certainly violates that, but it also sounds like she was being somewhat picky and trying to get her people to be clones of how she wanted to behave.
Absolutely.
And while that may be admirable in some ways, it may not be a match for some people, either their behavioral style or whatever. So, yeah, so I think that sounds like it relates back to the blind spots.
Absolutely.
That was a blind spot for her. So, what you mentioned earlier that the statement about blind spots are what did you say?
Your blind spot is your breakthrough or intention.
Your blind spot is your breakthrough. So
yes.
I'm very curious about that. And we were talking about that piece, and I let one thought go because we were on a roll, but I want to go back to it. So how do you prioritize? So let's say I start looking at my blind spots, I get feedback, and I get a lot of feedback, and there's 47 things that come up, and 9 of them are intense. How do you advise people on how to prioritize? Okay, what do I work first? Because even if you're working on 9, that's way too many probably. And you mentioned your coach had said, what's one small thing you can change? But what do you recommend? How do they prioritize that?
Yeah, usually I would say we try to get to 3 key themes, and they often collapse. Some of them will collapse. Yeah. And I don't like people trying to work on more than 3 things. It's just, there's something magical about the number 3.
Power of 3.
Yep. Yeah. In terms of prioritizing, I actually leave that a lot. By the time we've collapsed the information to 3 themes, they're all 3 are pretty strong and will have significant positive impact, as they work through them. But I like to move to where my clients like to move, where they feel there's going to be a particular payoff, where they feel particularly invested. Now, that could be certain stakeholders. Like sometimes the feedback is a little bit different with how they manage up versus sideways versus down. So maybe they're going to pick sort of a stakeholder group that feels more they're more inspired. It's really looking for like, what are you inspired to change? What feedback really excites you about changing? And then sometimes it's just criticality of a certain business unit that absolutely needs their attention, or so I kind of let my client decide, but I really try to get them to collapse it into 3 themes, like because the blind spots will tell you like what impact you're having on somebody, but they don't always completely, without the conversation with my client around what is your intention and what are you trying to accomplish. Sometimes there'll be really negative impact statements, and people will say they're being deliberate. So they're experimenting with the style. Maybe they're trying to be, one common example is they're trying to be an agitator. So maybe there's a certain group of people that are a little bit complacent, and they're trying to agitate this group. So they're experimenting with some leadership behaviors to kind of shake things up a little bit. And they don't really realize that those leadership behaviors, maybe are not landing. They're not really landing. Like people are not getting the memo, right?
Yeah, just upsetting them.
Exactly. So sometimes there's like some obvious things like that where it's like, this is just not working as a tactic. Like, how are we going to experiment with, I get what you're trying to do. You're trying to shake up this complacent group, but what are some other ways that are more, that could be more positive, that could be received? Or also just maybe there's a need for more transparency about what you're actually doing, and see what ideas the team has to get that outcome. So I guess that's how it's really, we jointly prioritize a little bit in terms of, because they know the other side of the coin. When I'm doing this investigation, I'm just hearing all the data points. So we have to kind of look at it together and figure out where's the biggest bang for the buck.
I'm struck by the book, The One Thing, by Gary Keller, where he talked about what's one thing you can do that'll make everything else easier or unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And are you ever finding that, and I love the power of 3, mm-hmm. but I do find sometimes with my client, they can't do more than 1. Do you find that also, that there's like one that you have 3 and they're all important, but it's like, oh, this one really jumps out because this is going to have the bigger impact?
Absolutely. I think I only want them working on 1 at a time, but for the most part, I'm working with people for 6 to 8 months, sometimes 12 months. So we can get through all 3 in a program, but we're looking for 1 at a time, Absolutely.
Cool. Marisa, one of the things you allude to in the blind spot, and then a book that you wrote, and then also on your website, is working smart. Mm-hmm. So my brother used to compare me to a dinosaur, big body, small brain. I've always been a hard worker. I just naturally was born a hard worker. I think it took me till I was about 50 to start realizing how I did not know how to work smart. Mm-hmm. And I'm 67 and still learning. So it's an ongoing process. But talk to me about what you've learned about working smart. You talked about your background, very systematic, but it had some limitations. But, this is I think this is a drum to beat with our audience is, where are some breakthroughs that you've really seen as far as working smart?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first book that I wrote 3 years after doing executive coaching is called Work Smart. And because I'm like a recovering engineer, it's an acronym. So it's each letter sort of stands for, and this was like my formula. It was the things that I saw people doing that I was like, wow, that's way easier than, or way more important or way more fundamental. So in that book, there's 9 areas that I kind of deem as like what's required to work smart. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. The first one, the first W stands for well. And for a long time, I ignored wellness stuff. Like you realize that like we can ignore it for a period of time and then it bites us, right? It's like a zero-sum multiplier if we don't if we don't get our wellness practices right. And I've seen that with my clients, when we are sleep deprived, when we're eating junk, when we're not having any time with people we love, when we're not doing any kind of meditative or stillness practice, we have to work harder because we're frankly inefficient and grumpy and ineffective in so many ways, right? So that's an example of like working smart is like, what's your fundamentals? What are your fundamentals? So well is one of them. Other examples in the book are being relationship driven. So I told you earlier that I had started my career being very deliverables and task and execution oriented. And at some point you realize that that'll get you so far, but if you treat every relationship like a transaction, there's no return on investment for that experience that you've had together, right? And so the R in work is about being relationship driven, being conscious, recognizing that every single person you meet, it's actually not a lot harder to treat the person as though you may have a relationship that lasts forever. Just to treat them that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I naturally love people, but I still have to slow myself down for the relational side because I'm very driven. And I've seen some studies on, people with gratitude and people with relationships seem to live longer.
Yeah.
And you look, for me, I'm older than you, but if I look at some of the older comedians like Dick Van Dyke, Carl Reiner, Mel Brooks, I think they're all in their 90s and they're still alive. And there's photos of them laughing together still. And so
it's amazing.
That relational side, when you get done with things, it's really the relationships that are the lasting part. Money comes and goes, achievements come and go.
Yeah. So there's other, like, another one is opportunity oriented. Like, how are you reframing every challenge into an opportunity? So my perspective on working smart in my formulaic mind, it's like, it's a whole series of small come-froms that are different than that just barrel through energy, right? It's just, it's being more strategic and being aware of the big picture and kind of carrying that little, like, if you had a little angel on your shoulder, it's carrying that through everything that you do. Because a lot of us, when I first start working with clients, they feel a little overwhelmed. They're like, how am I going to remember to do, or how am I going to find space in my calendar to do all these extra things? It's not about extra things. It's just about the awareness that you bring into all the things you're already doing.
It's funny you talk about the angel on the shoulder. Most young people wouldn't even be aware of that. But there's an angel on one shoulder, there's a devil on the other. Or as one guy I met, he called it the negativity committee in your brain, who beats you up on every mistake you've ever made.
Yes.
And challenges you or rushes you to make bad decisions. Right. You got to hurry, you got to do it.
Right.
And the angel always seems to speak in a nice, quiet voice.
Yeah.
And if you slow down, like what you're saying, and focus on the relational side, you're going to hear that angel more. Because
absolutely. And my angel was very, very wimpy compared to my devil. My devil was like sharp and fast and quick and loud.
They always are. They always are. Always are.
And my angel was wimpy. So for years, like I don't know, she would run away and leave me alone.
No. She was still there. She was just speaking quietly because the angel comes from a position that you have free choice.
Right.
And the angel's there out of love saying, I love you. Why don't you try this?
Yeah.
And you're like, no, I got to go. And you talk about not having that health piece, the first piece you brought up, the well-being. You don't have that moment to think. And then you, anyway, that's a whole nother conversation, but
it was beautiful though. It's really, and it's true that, part of working smart, like the last chapter is called T for tenacity, at the end of SMART. And I define tenacity as holding certainty of an outcome in advance of any evidence. So then this is about your aspirations. So it's like you have aspirations, and as you're moving towards your aspiration, it can be really daunting. You can really feel like you're not going to get there. And your job is to be tenacious and be like, I'm going to hold certainty that I'm on my way here in advance of any evidence. Because if you have evidence, it's like you're not being tenacious. You just have evidence, right? So how do you hold the aspiration, and how do you move towards it, gently? And the reality is the angel is what whispers that aspiration, continues to whisper like, yeah, I don't know, that's okay. Through all the setbacks, through all the valleys, through all those kinds of things. And if you're not quiet enough to hear it, then it's very hard to remain optimistic during, when we're doing really important things. They're not easy.
Well, let me build on that perspective a little bit. So years ago, I adapted the belief. I came to the conclusion that from my perspective and life experience, persistence was you just go at it and you keep going at it and you keep running into that brick wall. Tenacity is you run into the brick wall and you're like, oh, I ran into a brick wall. Maybe there's another way around. And that's the quiet voice, the angel is saying, hey, if you go to your left about 30 feet, you can walk around the brick wall. Whereas the devil's going, get through that wall, hit the wall harder, do it more time. Yeah. So that's something there. I focused on your blind spot book, which is the most recent release. But I am curious whether in any of your work you have come across the practice of, whether you call it mantras, power statements, whatever it might be, but in this quiet time, dictums is what one coach gave me, where, and Huberman over at Stanford gets into this, of creating new neural pathways.
Absolutely.
By repeating certain things. I find that negativity committee wants me to repeat very negative things about myself and build those neural pathways. So they are multi-lane freeways in my brain.
Yeah.
Whereas the quiet voice is saying something quite different that I believe is more truthful and certainly what I need to focus on.
Absolutely.
Have you done any work or study in that area with those types of?
Yeah, I have. So I was the biggest skeptic 9 years ago around affirmations. I used to kind of make fun of like those kinds of things, and I've become the biggest advocate. I make meditations and write affirmations with 90% of my clients, and it is the most transformational thing that I've come up with when you really have to shift. You really have to shift the negative talk track in your mind. So when, and the negative talk track is in everybody's mind, but there's certain periods in life where, it just gets on a roll and it just gets very loud. And it's very hard because remember, we always have to remember that our conscious mind is very small and our subconscious mind is always kind of running the show. And our thoughts are always, they're just always surfacing. And our brain is only going to do what it did yesterday, because that's kind of its pattern. It's like, did I do this yesterday and I'm still alive? Then cool, let's do this again. And so it's going to constantly just do. And if you want to build a new neural pathway, and if you want to shift a thought pattern, you have to basically repeat to your brain. I always laugh because like in artificial intelligence is kind of modeled after intelligence, right? And so what is intelligence? How does our brain learn? Our brain learns by hearing things over and over and over again, and then memorizes an algorithm and a rule associated with that, and then runs off of that. So the only way to change it is to repeat and repeat and repeat the things that you want to feel, want to believe, want to see, and you have to overcome the negativity bias of the entire world. I mean, as a leader, the biggest correlation is positivity and optimism. The world is not positive and optimistic. It's very hard to live in this world. So your brain is being bombarded by all these messages that really feed that negativity track. And you as an entrepreneur or a leader or a visionary, you have to be in a space of positivity and optimism, which means you have to be listening to enough of those messages for you to counteract what the society is giving you. So what does that look like? I sit down with my clients. Most of my clients will end up with between 80 and 100 affirmations in a 15-minute meditation. I bombard them. So I probably have 300 of my favorite, what I would call helpful beliefs statements. Like one of my favorite is, I always have time for my top priorities. Because everyone's dealing with time scarcity. I don't have time. And if you just repeat, I always have time for my top priorities, what your brain goes is, oh, what's my top priority? It just immediately forces you. And then it's like, oh, let's work on that.
Well, the other part of that is it eliminates things. It realizes that the screaming devil on your shoulder that's saying, you got to do this, you got to do this. You're like, no, I don't have to do that. That's
Exactly.
not my
Exactly.
priority. And you have the power to set it aside.
Yeah.
So,
So there's like these little one-liners that to me I've collected over the years, and then we write them. We sort of calmly we adjust them. We make sure to adjust them. I record them to them for them, and I tell them you have to listen minimum of 14 days once a day. And I don't have any rules. You don't have to sit still. You don't have to breathe deeply. You can play it in the car. You can play it walking the dog. You can even play it while doing email because the subconscious mind picks it up. It's not for your conscious mind. It will hear it no matter how. So I just like every single day for 14 days. If you don't like it after 14 days, you can quit. Almost all of them continue, some of them for multiple years. Even when they go off of it, they come back and do it again when they feel their brain's kind of gone astray. And what's funny is even my resistors these funny things will happen. They'll say, I'm just 6 weeks later, they'll be like, I'm just really feeling a lot more optimistic. And I'll say, oh, that's really great. Like, what do you think it is? Oh, I don't know what it is. And then I'll say, well, are you still listening to your affirmations? And they'll say, well, yeah, but it's not that.
yeah.
And I'm like, you're right. It's not that.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. So a few thoughts to share along the same line. I remember hearing decades ago, there was a very successful guy who started an insurance company, and this was 50 years ago or more. But he had the whole company come in. There were like 50 people. And maybe I'm wrong on the number of people, but he would have everybody at the start of every day gather and they would shout 50 times, do it now. Mm. Do it now, do it now, do it now. Mm-hmm. And when I first did dictums, I was being coached by a guy and he had me handwrite certain verses in the Bible. And there's something about the brain connection of handwriting.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but it makes it so much more powerful. Mm-hmm. That was my first experience. But recently I got back into it. My wife had heard something by Joyce Myers on her power statements. So I developed a list of power statements for myself, 10 of them. They're too long by some people's standards, but they're very helpful for me. They hit on 10 very important areas. And I memorized them, and I find, and I'm not bragging when I say this, but I find that there are times, I wish there were more times, but there are times in the day where I run into a tough situation and I'm able to pick part of one or say one to remind myself I'm going to get through it.
Absolutely.
And it's very powerful.
Yeah. And I feel like what they do is they create like, I talk about it being reframe ready. Like, so reframing is a very, very important strategy for,
I like it,
for coping. Right. And if you, but reframe is a lot of work because here you are, you're kind of stressed. There's a bad situation. You're in sort of a triggered negative emotional state. And now you have to reframe. It's really hard. It's kind of like scratching a record player to stop. You know, it's a very different thing to do. Having said that, if you've seeded some meaningful statements in your mind and they've heard them enough time, it's like your brain brings it for you, and sort of in that moment it surfaces. So in your example, part of your messaging just comes to you in that moment. So that's what you're doing. I think you're seeding all of these kind of like reframes that are ready for the situation, and it's a much more beautiful way to live. And I teach all the strategies I have to my boys. They're 20 and 16, and it's really funny. Just the other night, my son said, he had an internship that fell through because of layoffs and all this kind of stuff. And so he's kind of sad. He's got to hustle his way. And he said, you know, I'm feeling like it's really hard. So tonight I'm going to write some new affirmations. I'm going to record them. And a couple of days later, he's like, they're totally working. Like, I can't believe how hard, I can't believe how easy this is. Like, why does not everybody know about this hack, you know? And it's just helping him. It's helping him with just that little bit of keeping his brain in the game during a tough time.
You know, it strikes me, particularly in our victim culture that we have so often today, as a reminder to the audience that going back to your cultural biases, but our biases, I'm going to expand that or extend it. This is something you said earlier. We all have different life experiences, and all of us have some pain in those life experiences. Although a buddy of mine, Pat Fitzhenry, says, you know, Dave, I just had a Leave It to Beaver childhood. So which many in the audience may not know what that is. But so, but most of us have some pain. And I know he's got some, maybe it wasn't his childhood, but later. But we all have that, and it affects our views. So we have to be careful when we're writing these statements. Mm-hmm. These are not hateful statements. Mm-hmm. These are not judgmental statements of other people. Mm-hmm. These are, like you use the term, it's affirmations, something mm-hmm. positive. Mm-hmm. These are the person we want to be.
Absolutely.
Actually, more than who we are.
Yeah.
Often.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree?
Oh yeah. When I'm getting them to write them, I'm always like, I want you to be just on the edge of like, you have to be on this little edge. Like you can't be on the, like your brain's going to throw it out. Like there's no way you're that, right? But you have to be on this little, like this edge of I'd like to be, or I am sometimes, or 1% of the time I'm like this and I want to be like this more. So you're just trying to kind of push that edge of who you want to be. When in your best self, you're writing these affirmations down. What do I believe when I'm in my best state of mind, when I'm my best self, when I'm my best leader, when I'm most inspired? And then you repeat those and it just elevates. It just elevates everything you're capable of doing.
Wonderful. That's great stuff. Something else in your blind spots book, you talk about false assumptions. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a tremendous problem today that people take partial truths and they exaggerate it or expand it based on their wounds often mm-hmm. to judge or verbally assault other people. Mm-hmm. And it's very toxic. And mm-hmm. I loved what we just talked about with the affirmations and really learning how to be our better selves. But talk about the false assumptions. And one of your phrases jumped out to me: false assumptions can be acquired. And I felt like in parentheses, you need to say from social media, from toxic friends, from people you shouldn't be hanging out with or whatever. So talk about the false assumptions piece, because so many of us get caught in it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I noticed that false assumptions are inherited very much in the workplace. I mean, they're probably inherited everywhere, but in the workplace, there can be like, for instance, one of my clients was really struggling with a particular group in terms of a collaboration and had all kinds of statements around how they're not collaborative, they don't know what they're doing, they're not very skilled, they're leaders. It's like all of these data points that they thought were data points, but were a lot of like interpretation and emotionally charged judgments. Like that's kind of what they were. Yeah. And I started asking questions like, well, what projects have you worked on together? And there's like, well, no, they're impossible to work with. Like there was no data, like no actual first person experience. Yeah. And so all of these assumptions are sort of hearsay and this and I think that it's, it's like to me, false assumptions are almost like procrastination. Like procrastination is a soothing mechanism for the brain. It's something we don't want to do something. And so it's kind of like, it's like a soother, like a baby soother. Like, so it convinces us to go do all these other things, right? And when they do brain scans and people are procrastinating, it actually is in the soothing centers. So it's like the brain trying to help us avoid is to try to soothe us and make us feel, safe and stuff. And false assumptions, I think, kind of do a similar thing where we don't have to take action. We don't have to be courageous. We don't have to be curious. We don't have to be thoughtful. We don't have to we eliminate all of these things that might actually feel like work. And we adopt or we bring these generalizations. But the way I think the fastest way to catch them is to realize that it causes you to not take action. So when a lot of times I'll hear false assumptions and they're all as like justifications for not taking action or not moving forward or not embracing or not being curious or not talking, not going to the next level. So to me, it's a little bit of this, it's kind of like a lazy, like, so when I want people to realize that when you're making assumptions or you're inheriting assumptions, like you're being lazy, like this is not your best self.
It's interesting. And I think that, I first heard it from Danny Silk. I don't know where he got it, but he says there's two major emotions, love and fear, and everything comes from one or the other.
Right.
And it seems like false assumptions play to our fears.
Absolutely.
So we quickly adopt them.
Mhm.
And they can, I mean, to be fair, they can play to our love, where we want to be hopeful and overly
Right.
optimistic. That's
Yes.
been me, Dave the Dreamer.
Yeah.
And but my wife Kelly has developed something recently where she's been in a situation with some people who jump to false assumptions.
Yeah.
And so she'll go, "Excuse me, were you there when this happened?
Right.
Were you
Yeah.
part of that conversation?
Yeah.
Were you there? Oh, okay. Okay. Well, then, maybe we need to get more involved and communicate more or something." I don't know how she handles it from there, but
No, for sure. And
strong
going
stuff.
and what's really important these days, and with my boys too, they'll come home with some opinion and they'll have heard it somewhere. And I'll be like, okay, let's go to source. Like, where did that come from? And where did that come from? And where did that come from? And like, when you go, it's so fascinating when you get to source how different the thing is. Like, you just really, I try to have a rule, like I'm not going to comment on something unless I've actually seen it or read it myself. And that's a hard rule to live by. But it's really very powerful because then you actually know, why you're thinking what you're thinking instead of allowing. Remember, our brains are just sponges. They're just absorbing things without discernment. And actually, my little sister used to make fun of me because years ago when I was an engineer, I would work in very, very remote areas and I'd be like alone in the middle of nowhere and there'd be like bad TV. And I often worked funny shifts. So then I'd be up in the middle of the night and I'd turn on the TV and all there ever was infomercials playing. And I would watch this infomercial because I thought they were funny. And then the first time I would, but they would be on repeat because there was no TV in the middle of the night. So the first iteration through, and I'd be like working or something at the same time, not even really listening. But the first iteration through, I think that's the dumbest thing in the entire world. And then the second iteration through, I'd be like, ooh, that's really interesting. And then by the third, I'd be like dialing the 1-800 number to order the thing that I don't need. And my sister, I'd come home with like mega memory or something. And she's like, what did you buy now? And I was like, I don't know. Like it was repeating. And I was like, I need it, like, so it's so important that we remember that unless we discern what this brain picks up, we're going to do things that people are just feeding us, that's getting fed to us. And that's not what we're meant to do as humans. We're meant to advance humanity. We're not supposed to just gobble up whatever happens to be around.
That's funny because they just came out with a study this week that says that because there's so many people working remote, online shopping has gone through the roof during work hours.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
okay. So Marisa, I want to thank you very much. This has been great. I know you've got your third book out, Blind Spot, but you've also got some great stuff on your website, some free assessments. So how do you want to close this out to give our audience one last thing or a few last things?
Absolutely. So I'm so thrilled to be here. And I know that your audience is passionate about their development. Otherwise, they wouldn't be listening to these. So I really want to encourage everybody to try and take advantage of as many of the assessments on my website as possible. It's leaderly.com and it's LEY/tools. And you can go in there and there's all kinds of reflection tools that you can do, which will give you some ways to get a sense of, what might be your potential blind spots, or also some ideas, some reflection. There's actually a work smart assessment that can give you a sense of where are you scoring high or perhaps have opportunities to work a little bit differently. So the assessments are a great place to start. And certainly I actually have something a little bit special in my blind spots book where there's a little giveaway with this it's called Feedback Friend. So if you go to feedbackfriend.ai, there's a little form that you can fill out and it will automatically email people for some feedback and give you a general sort of summarized report that keeps the responses anonymous. So that's another fun way to kind of get some feedback as a leader if you want to do it remotely. So anyway, I would just encourage your listeners to dive into this idea of getting feedback and finding that way that they can just get 1% more effective, because when each of us get 1% more effective, especially as leaders, that's where we can maximize our impact to the world.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you so much for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.